invitation. It's a real honor and pleasure, and I'm very thankful to be here at Beijing and to share with you some thoughts. Look, I will start maybe with the most general conclusion of our analysis. No? The main conclusion is that with the emergence of China or re-emergence of China in the last 10 or 15 years with regions such as Latin America, but also as we have seen in India, in Africa and other countries, there is a huge room for tensions and also for cooperation. And so the ability to negotiate today and to support institutions is critical. Otherwise, tensions will increase. No? If we do not have today, I would say, a harmonious relationship, the relationship will not be harmonious tomorrow. No? I read today the China Daily, and Xi Jinping presented yesterday in a conference the idea, among others, that China very clearly has development goals in the short, medium, and long run, which is very intelligent, and I think this is very strategic. I would say, by the way, other countries have this very similar development goals. So critical is how to negotiate about this and what you do. If you want to import a full car, it is very clear that China wants to export this car to Russia, to Mexico, to Brazil, to other countries. And of course, Mexico, Brazil, Russia, India, and others would like to take part in this value chain in terms of employment, in terms of innovation, etc. This tension, I would say, is critical for the case of Latin America in 2013. I have 20 minutes, so I will go pretty quickly through some of these topics, and you have access to the presentation. I would invite you, if you are interested in learning more on the Latin American experience with China in the last 10, 20, and 500 years, go through some of these documents. I would particularly invite you in the last part. There is this link to a newly established academic network of Latin America and the Caribbean on China. So we are trying to socialize the dialogue within Latin America in the academic sector together with the public and private sectors, with people from more than 20 countries in Latin America, including also, of course, China. No? And finally, I would invite you, and I think this is related to several of the talks and discussions from yesterday and the day before yesterday, to take seriously and consider the concept of new triangular relationships that are being generated through the re-emergence of China. We've published there a group of reflections on this concept, and very concretely on the relationship of how, for example, the re-emergence of China is affecting, generating new challenges of the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States. But you could very clearly analyze with this concept of new triangular relationships, for example, a well-established relationship between Japan and the United States, and how China is changing this relationship, or between Russia and the United States and China, and you can again imagine of a lot of new triangular relationships. What I want to share is simply some qualitative reflections, I would tell you, based on a group of analysis in the last 10 or 15 years that we've been doing in Latin America. I would simply tell you that in general the research and the discussion in the private sector, in the public sector, in the academic sector in most of Latin America is insufficient, but we have an increasing growth of analysis from a regional perspective with institutions such as the Inter-American Development Bank, but also the Economic Commission on Latin America, but also in Argentina, Brazil, Cuba, and many other countries, and of course also in China. In China, I'm very pleased to be here with colleagues from the Nankai University, from Peita, and we have another group of institutions that have been working on this Latin America-China relationship in the last 10 years. One qualitative issue that I would like to highlight, you have the paper, this is analyzed much more in depth, that is critical for Latin America in 2013. Most of Latin American countries, including countries such as Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and many others, have in the last 20 years very coherently started a strategy, I would say, of export-oriented industrialization. Particularly, countries such as Mexico have been extremely successful in increasing its share over total exports worldwide to Europe, to Latin America, particularly to the United States. Based, I would say, on a view of free trade, and Mexico is, in this case, I would say, the world champion of free trades. So we have 14 FTAs with 44 countries, not with China. There is a discussion in the paper on this. China, from the perspective and the work we have been doing, and we've been working on innovation, on yarn textile garment, on automobile, auto parts, electronics, and more than 15 sectors comparatively, Latin America, Mexico with China. I would say that China is doing things qualitatively different than most of Latin America, and by the way, I would say very differently than Europe and in the United States. What is, in a few words, I have a little time, but go through some of these documents, what is probably qualitatively the most important difference in terms of long-term strategies between most of Latin American countries and China? I would highlight the omnipresence and the particular relevance of the public sector in China. The public sector in China, against the very simplistic view of the World Bank and the OECD, among others, which states that the central government presence in China in terms of economy and other items in terms of fiscal revenues, that the central government's presence and share over the total economy is falling, which equals, from this very primitive perspective, I would say that the private sector is increasing its share. I would say this is not correct. The public sector in China is much more than the central government. The public sector is, yes, the central government, but as relevant are the cities, as relevant are the municipalities, and as relevant are the provinces. So when you analyze, for example, the automobile auto parts sector, you find the particular and critical relevance of strategies, policies, revenues, huge amounts of money in terms of investment, in terms of financing, etc., of the public sector, not necessarily of the central government. And this in Latin America we lack. This is the local part of the public sector is very weak, in most of the cases not present. And so what we have in China is, I would say, a pretty strong and rather coherent, with a lot of contradictions, long-term strategy, not necessarily of the central government, in most of the cases, yes, but particularly of the other groups within the public sector. And this, again, for most of Latin America, this is very difficult to understand. What does this mean? And I will show you some pictures, and then I will conclude. No? I would remind you, China is very quickly closing the gaps with most of Latin America and other countries in terms of GDP per capita. Today, still, Latin America as a group has twice the GDP per capita than China. But this is closing very quickly. If you see the GDP per capita growth in the last 30 years, you find out that China, for example, in terms of GDP growth, has been growing 13 times more than Mexico. No? Not 13%, but 13 times more. Year by year, GDP growth in this period. For China has been 9%, in Mexico it has been 0.8%. Also, this catch-up process is very impressive. And the topic I want to briefly focus is simply to understand this new engagement between China and Latin America in the last 10 years. China and Latin America have a long tradition, starting with Admiral Chen before Cristobal Columbus in the 15th century. But in the last 10 years, the trade engagement between Latin America and China, by the way, with countries that China has diplomatic relationships and not, this is not relevant. The presence of China in terms of imports and exports has been dramatic. No? In many cases, 10 years ago, China was not even in the statistics. Today, China is the second major trading partner of Latin America, only after the United States. If you still take the European Union as one, China would be the third, and very soon it would be still the second. What are some of the characteristics? Well, this again is the share of imports and exports of Latin America growing very fast in the last 10 to 15 years. By the way, but this is another topic, Latin America is also critical for China. Latin America today is the third most important trading partner for China. No? If you take Latin America as one region. No? So again, China should also take much more seriously Latin America. This we have disaggregated at the 10-digit level of the harmonized system by country, by regions, etc. 2 or 3 relevant issues. Yes, trade is growing, but as yesterday we heard also for the case, for example, of India, with an increasing and very substantial trade deficit for Latin America. No? So yes, exports from Latin America to China are booming, but particularly Chinese exports to Latin America. This is an increasing problem. No? There is no region with which Latin America has such a huge trade deficit, and very clearly with a downward trend. As relevant, and this we have studied with a lot of detail, again by sectors, by country, etc. This is probably, I would tell you, one of the most relevant issues in terms of understanding not only yo-yo economics, things go up and down and down and up, but in the end you understand very little. But to understand that Latin America is exporting to China mainly raw materials with no value added and with no level of technology. This lower graph is telling you that today 5% of Latin American exports to China have a a medium and high technology level. On the contrast, see the gap. No? China's exports to Latin America account for 60% in terms of medium and high technology, which means that Latin America is exporting soya beans, oil, gas, minerals with no value added, and we have studied minerals in Chile, soya beans in Argentina, and many other cases with the name of the firm, etc. And what you will find is a downgrading process. This is, I quoted Xi Jinping when I started, China wants to develop and to upgrade in terms of technology. No? So what has been the result? The result has been that in trade negotiations of China with Argentina, China said, I am going to make all the transformation processes, not you, Argentina. No? So if you were able to transform not only soya beans, but cake and oil of soya beans, Argentina, you will not do that. I will do that. No? And it became so tense that in 2011, because Argentina said, what you want to do, I want to do also, it became so tense that for 6 months, China stopped imports from soya beans from Argentina, which account for 85% of Argentinian exports to China. Again, simply to show you the tensions that are behind this chart, this graph, and I will tell you in terms of negotiations between Latin American countries and China. In terms, I would tell you very briefly also, in terms of these triangular relationships, on this we have worked a lot. I would tell you simply to understand these tensions. At one point, at the end of the 1990s, 2000, Mexico and China at one point competed in the US market regarding yarn, textile, and garments. Look what happened in the last 10 years. So in 2012, China accounts for 40%. If we include Hong Kong and Macau, China accounts for almost 50% of US exports in yarn, textile, garments. And we have a group of countries from Mexico to Central America with a huge gap. There is no competition. No? So China has very clearly, very quickly outcompeted most of Latin America in sectors like this. I could show you the same for sectors such as electronics, auto parts, and many others. Briefly, regarding China's foreign direct investment in Latin America, I would tell you that, and this is very interesting, that in most of the world it is not understandable, and that China today is the third major source of foreign direct investment in the world. Number one is the United States, number two is Japan, number three is China. And economists and many others love to put tables, no? Things grow, the share, distribution, correlations, etc. But we do not understand that China's foreign direct investment is qualitatively absolutely different than any other foreign direct investment in the world. I invite you to go through the paper, but I will tell you there is no country in the top 20 sources of foreign direct investment that have so huge institutional filters to allow for foreign direct investment, and I come back to the issue of the public sector. This is in China. You have positive lists of what you are allowed to acquire and to buy outside of China. In the rest of the world, we have negative lists. All that you cannot buy is allowed. No?
You have 2 minutes.
You have 2 minutes. Okay, good. So you have a group of institutions that, from the National Development Reform Commission, catalogs that allow you to buy or not according to the public sector, etc. What does this mean? I will simply go to the results. We have been working on more than 5,000 FDI transactions from China. No? The result is that for the period 2000-2012, 87% of China's FDI to Latin America is being done by the public sector. No? The private sector has a very small participation and a high level of coherence. This is of the public sector's buyout and OFDI in Latin America, 99.5% is for buying raw materials. No? So this is coherent with the catalogs, the strategies of the public sector, and reinforces the gaps and problems regarding trade in the last 10 years. There is a lot of other questions, but this I leave aside, and other issues. So what are some of the conclusions of all this? I would say that the relationship, strictly in terms of trade and investment between Latin America and China, is not sustainable. You can reach Brevich 50 or 60 years ago, but this will not work. These gaps in terms of trade deficit, in terms of technology intensity, among others, does not allow for Latin American development in short, medium, and long run. This is not a complaint against China. This is simply saying we have to work on this issue. And secondly, I would say what is not working today, and if Xi Jinping says China wants to have a growing presence in the world, including in Latin America, what is particularly weak in China and in Latin America are public, private, and academic institutions. Today, apparently, foreign policy in China is being dictated by MOFCOM, no? The Ministry of Commerce. This is not sufficient. We need a stronger cooperation, regional cooperation, a stronger coherence in terms of public of the overseas foreign direct investment, and I think there is a huge room for working. If not, there is a huge room also for conflict in countries within Latin America in which you have a long tradition against, or I would say in anti-Chinese movements and in social movements against China. This is not a threat, but simply saying if we do not work in this direction, there will be a very unharmonious relationship. Thank you very much.